But I also wanted to look at what happened during, the 1918 flu pandemic and what happened to the population in New York City. I was really kind of curious about this. So did people flee New York City for the suburbs? And, would that be an analog to what we're experiencing now? So I put together a spreadsheet after I did a little bit of research, and I will show you this now. Where is it? So this is a spreadsheet of US Census data. And then I added some stuff from New York Open Data, which is a great place to get info on New York City. And I wanted to look at what had happened to the population in New York City. So you can see this highlighted part here. This is by every 10 years. So 1910, there was 4,766,000 people in New York City. And by 1920, which is, a year and a half after the onset of the the 1918 flu pandemic in New York City, 5,620,000 people. That's a 17% increase, almost 18% more people in New York City between 1910 and 1920, which includes the flu pandemic. So it did not slow down the growth very much, it seems, in New York City post Spanish flu epidemic. And if you look on into the 20s, from 1920 to 1930, it went from 5.6 million to 6.9 million, which is the roaring 20s, right? So 23% growth during the 20s, which was right after the flu pandemic. Now, it's so hard to really make parallels because the world is a different place every year and every decade, and certainly 100 years ago, it was a different place. So, but that is to say that, there was not really much of a slowdown there in terms of the growth of New York City. In fact, growth in New York City slowed down precipitously during the Depression era in the 30s, from 1930 to 1940, it was only 7% growth. And it wasn't until like the 1960s and up until the 1980s that you saw real decreases in the population in New York. Now, the other thing that is interesting and worth paying attention here is that Manhattan acted differently than Brooklyn and Queens. Now, in Manhattan, in this same year, going back to 1910, from 1910 to 1920, there was a negative 2% growth. And then during the Depression, there was a negative 18% growth. So that suggests that people did leave Manhattan. And Manhattan, I'm sure, always having been a fairly expensive place to live and very crowded, that kind of makes a little bit of sense. But what's interesting is when you go over and you look here at Brooklyn and Queens, you see that even while Manhattan from the 1910 to 1920 lost a couple of percent in terms of population, Brooklyn saw a 19% increase in growth, in population growth, and Queens saw a 65% increase in population growth from 1910 to 1920. Now, during the Depression, in the 1930s, Manhattan again lost 18% of its population. Brooklyn saw 21%, even more growth, and Queens saw 130% growth during that time. These are crazy numbers. And what's really interesting, so not only did New York City continue to grow throughout after the pandemic of 1918, but it also it does seem like the borough mattered a little bit. And I didn't look into Staten Island and the Bronx as much, but they're similar to Brooklyn and Queens, just much smaller. So so there's a lot you could conjecture, and I haven't done this particular research, but I would put money on it, that a lot of people during those times from 1910 to 1940 or 1920 to 1940 saw a move from Manhattan to Brooklyn and Queens. And we've been seeing that recently as well. Pricing in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens has been outpacing pricing in Manhattan. So my guess is that you're going to see some of that same thing that I was talking about in the beginning, which is some inclination for people to move from you know, densely populated urban centers to more suburban centers. That could also mean things like moving to the G line in Brooklyn or into Queens. You know, that could also mean moving out to, I don't know, Flushing, or it could mean, or Jackson Heights, or Bushwick and Bed-Stuy. And I think that if we see an exodus, I don't think we'll see an exodus of, you know, of grand proportions to places far flung, but we may see even more demand in the outer boroughs and nearby suburbs than we see in people moving to Manhattan. So that's just something to think about. I thought this was very interesting numbers when I took a look at them and analyzed them a little bit. I'm happy to share this with you if you want. I'll probably create a post and put it on my site so you can see if you want to explore more. And that's it. That's just my thoughts on whether people are going to move out or not. Okay. Talk to you.